Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the next installment in the Grenzbach Lear & Associates webinar series, Strategies for Your Membership Base, Realizing Its Philanthropic Potential. Today's webinar is co-presented by Suzanne Hilser-Wiles, Vice President, and Matthew Slovett, Solutions Consultant in Philanthropic Analytics. Suzanne Hilser-Wiles brings to the firm over 15 years of experience in advancement, program building, and campaign planning and implementation in nonprofit organizations, including University of North Carolina School of the Arts, Cancer Care, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Before joining GG&A, Matthew Slovett worked as an associate consultant with the Whelan Group, a strategic advisory firm to nonprofits, and as an analyst with JP Morgan, where he worked in the syndicated and leveraged finance group. Since joining the firm, Matthew has helped many nonprofit organizations analyze the philanthropic potential of their donor populations and identify those constituents with the greatest likelihood to support their institutions. Our presenters welcome any questions you have during today's session, and we'll answer those questions in the time remaining at the end of the hour. To address a question to Suzanne and Matthew, please use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. Select all participants from the drop-down menu and send us any questions you might have. Any questions we don't answer today will be addressed in a follow-up message we send next week. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll also send out a recording of the session and the slide deck, as well as a short survey to gain your feedback. Thank you all again for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over to Suzanne to get us started.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Joan, and thank you all for joining us today. We know your time is precious, and we appreciate your participation. Our first slide is the agenda. These are the topics that we will cover during the course of our time together, and we will get started right away since it took us a little while to get going. On our first slide after the agenda, you will see a self-audit. We have left you with some questions that you and your team might consider after today's presentation to better assess where you are now. The first part is are the qualitative questions. If you look at question 1, and I won't read these, I'll offer some commentary on what we're trying to get you to think about as you look at these questions. In question number 1, are you acknowledging that your members are now part of your institution's community? As you talk to them, are you just describing benefits they receive, or are you starting to talk about the impact that their support has on your institution? This is a really a common thing we hear from donors at our clients, that they don't always understand what good their gift does for the institution. With question number 2 about buying benefits versus investing at your institution, we know that at every institution, there is a point at which membership gift goes from being more about the benefits to being more about the institutional support. That's often the place where you think about your members going from regular membership to upper-level membership. Do you know where that point is for your institution so that you can start to customize your approach to those members? Our third question is about segmenting our membership base. And as you will hear, there are many ways to segment our populations, and customizing key messages will enable us to move people up the membership pyramid more quickly and more cost-effectively, and that's part of what we want you to start to think about today. And finally, are members taking advantage of their benefits? If members, particularly new members, aren't using their benefits, we know and you know that they are far less likely to see the value in renewing. So we want to be sure that people are accessing their benefits and really making the most of their membership. So again, the questions on this slide and the next slide, which Matthew will go over, are really to help you do a self-assessment after our discussion today to figure out where your institution is.
Thank you, Suzanne. This is Matthew Slovett speaking. The next page has some analytical focused questions. A lot of nonprofits that we work with have a treasure chest of data in their donor management system or their membership database that's being vastly underutilized. So what we encourage clients to do, or organizations that we speak with or work with, is to really look internally first at what information that you have already and how are you effectively utilizing it. The other thing that I'd say before walking through these questions that I have on this page here is to not be overly consumed with the goal and the question of how perfect the data is. The data is never going to be perfect. It's an unrealistic goal to hold off on implementing or actioning on strategies until you realize perfection in the data You want to have accurate data that you feel confident in utilizing, but don't feel it needs to be perfect for every single constituent in your database. Use the data that you have, that you're confident with, to start informing strategic directions that you want to go in. The first question here, what information do you capture for your members and donors? When members first sign up, are you capturing age as one data point that can help in segmentation? And we'll see that a little bit later in the presentation. Are you capturing visit information? How frequently are members coming in contact with the institution? Does the data you capture differ for subsets of your constituency? Once someone becomes a donor, do you have a mechanism by which you're capturing more information? Maybe their specific interest in a certain set of programs that your institution is conducting. Do you use data in real time? We're increasingly having conversations with arts and culture organizations about capturing visit info on non-members as well as members and donors to inform communication strategies in real time. So I'll give you one very quick example. We have a theater client that identifies high-level subscribers in advance of the show that they're planning on attending and reaches out to them to offer special benefits around that show. One example being pre-ordering of beverages at intermission to avoid waiting in the line. One little example, but you in your own context can think creatively around if you had data in real time of high-level members, high-level donors coming in contact with your institution, either a performance or an exhibition, how can you more effectively craft a customized message to them to help them understand that you're consciously thinking about their interests and needs? This ties directly into 4 with how does data drive your strategic decision making. I would encourage all of you on this call at the end of this presentation to schedule a meeting internally and start to ask yourself these questions and get an understanding of the historical landscape at your institution of how effectively do you think you've used data to drive the strategies, particularly new strategies that you might implement going forward. And then most importantly, and this 5th question is often, we find, the most forgotten or neglected aspect of developing data-driven strategies is really having a feedback loop, both external and internal, to course correct. As you're testing new strategies, you want to make sure that you have a mechanism to be able to prove to leadership on your team as well as board members that the strategies that you're implementing are effective. So I would encourage you with both of these 2 slides at the beginning of the presentation to have these be a guide for a brainstorming session that you'd have internally with your team. With that, I'll hand it back over to Suzanne.
Thank you. Our next section is called Laying the Groundwork for Cultivation, and I really want to highlight something Matthew said. You know, everything does not have to be perfect, and you don't have to have all information in order to start to lay the groundwork for turning your members into donors. And there are 2 key pieces to this. The first is communications, and the second is creating a culture of customer service. And the communications piece, I would say that renewal and welcome materials really need to tie back to your mission. What does this money accomplish for your institution? As I said, one of the most common concerns we hear from donors is, I don't know what difference my gift makes. You need to be able to tell the story of impact for all gifts, no matter the size, if you want people to feel ownership in your institution. People will give a gift out of loyalty, but they give a much larger gift when they are inspired by what's happening with that money. Also, don't forget to acknowledge the relationship you have with that individual. If they're a lapsed member, for instance, you want to make sure that you recognize that they are returning and not just new to your communication. The more you can show that they are important to you, the more important their gift will feel to them. Finally, be sure you're consistent across your institution. You can talk about different programs and different communications, but if they aren't tied by a common vision, then you're not making the most of the dollars you spend on those vehicles. We have had clients who talk about different parts of their program in different vehicles, and that's a great way to educate people about all of the things happening at your institution. But if all of those programs don't feel tied together by one vision, then you're really missing the opportunity to reinforce the strong message of what you're accomplishing at your institution. The next slide just really talks about how and when you can communicate with members to further their investment in your institution. And I will give you an example from a major art museum with which we're working. They send an email to welcome new members for all members for whom they have a new email immediately after joining. So that happens within the first week. They follow up with a physical welcome packet in the mail that has the membership cards. And then in certain cases, they might send a customized welcome email from the head of membership to people who meet some criteria that they know closely correlate with upper-level members and donors at their institution. So we know somebody who recently joined this museum. She went on her first day, used her membership discount at the restaurant. Because there were things about the attributes of her donor profile that really fit the kind of constituent that they want to follow more closely, they sent out an email survey that they already had about their restaurant to her, asking for her opinion, saying, "We noticed that you just joined and we'd love your feedback." That made her feel very connected and valued by the institution immediately. And because she is someone we work with closely, she knew that this was also a client of ours, and that there was information about her that maybe they were able to glean from working with our analytics group. One of the other important points is point number 3 there. You share information about your institution, good news and bad, and that can help strengthen your relationship. And here I want to give an example from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. As many of you know, they had terrific success this spring or the summer with their Alexander McQueen exhibition. And one of the big benefits for joining the museum during that time was access to the exhibition. You got to cut the very long line that snaked around the block. Well, the last weekend, there were so many people who showed up to go to that exhibition that they couldn't honor that. In order to honor, if they honored that, then other visitors would never get in. It would be a safety hazard and people would be waiting far too long. So they had to cut that off without notice. They didn't realize how many people were going to be coming. But the week after that last weekend, every member got an email communication from the director of the museum explaining what had happened, saying, "We couldn't honor this benefit. This is why. We really thank you for your patronage. We thank you for your patience. And we're excited to tell you about the opportunity that this exhibition offered up to the Met as a fundraising opportunity, as a way to engage people." So all members got that, including the many like me who weren't there the last weekend. But by being proactive about telling people, "We're sorry, we realize your inconvenience, why we had to do it, and this is the end result," it made you feel like the Met cared, the Met was concerned about making good on the promises it made to you, and you felt excited to know the result of this exhibition. And that's a great example of, even when things don't go as smoothly as you would like, you can turn that into a way to bring people closer to your institution. The next slide is about creating a culture of customer service. Obviously, we all know that we have to have timely acknowledgement and delivery of membership cards. One thing I would point out to you, though, if you are expecting a big jump in membership because of a special event or a special exhibition, and there will be a lag time in people getting their cards, it's really important that you communicate that. Go ahead and tell people when they sign up. It'll be 3 weeks until you get your card, where normally it might be 3 days. Or it might be, instead of 3 weeks, a month. And explain how they can still use their benefits after they've joined but before they get their card. Again, you proactively give them information so then it doesn't turn into a customer service issue for you. You have to follow through with all promised benefits and make them easy to use. As you all know, it is so much better to promise fewer benefits and deliver them with grace than to overpromise and underdeliver. If you are having, again, what you think is a major event or blockbuster exhibition that's going to spur your membership, be really careful in what you promise people. Now is not the time to try and be aspirational. You need to be honest about what your institution can deliver effectively, particularly if you expect that a lot of people are going to be new to you. You know, everyone is a member of your customer service staff, and this is really important. We were just talking to one of our museum clients about this. They realized that the security guards were trained to interact with the public as if they were, of course, security guards first and foremost, and not thinking about the fact that they were part of the visitor services experience. And as just inserting the person from the membership desk to explain a little bit about the visitor experience to the guards as part of their training, they were able to really turn around that interaction. Security guards were still able to do what they needed to do, but people felt more welcome in the galleries. I think that sometimes institutions really underestimate how important this is. We worked with a client that was a major art museum several years ago and did a member survey. This is a museum that enjoys very high renewal rates. People are very happy with their membership. The #1 complaint that members had was about CoCheck. It was about their interaction with the CoCheck people. Not only their own interaction, but their perception of how CoCheck people were interacting with the general public. So these were people that felt a lot of ownership in the museum, and they felt like, well, when guests come to my museum, they're not feeling welcome. In this particular institution, the museum decided to do, again, customer service training, and I think it had an enormous impact on how the public perceived their experience at the museum. It didn't really impact, in this case, membership renewals, which were also very high, and people were not going to not renew because of that, but they gave the museum really valuable information for the visitor experience. Also, it is really important to track benefits when you can, but we do realize that not all institutions have the capability to really track closely all of the use of benefits. So you might want to consider something like 4 months before the end of a membership, a one-year membership cycle. With new members, you might do an email to all members who are new at that point in their renewal cycle and just remind them about what's happening at your institution in the next 4 months. Just give them reasons to come back so that you're making sure that you're doing what you can to remind them to use their benefits. You know, you might include a message about, you know, don't forget it's easy to park, or, you know, Monday or Friday nights we have music, something that reminds them that there is real value to their benefits. And sometimes people just forget to come, honestly, and it's always just good to reach out to them and point out that you hope that they're making the most of their membership.
Wonderful. Thank you, Suzanne. Moving now to the knowing your donor and your member profile, what I'm going to spend the next 10 or 15 minutes talking about is how you start to build the profile of your members with the ultimate goal of not only increasing your retention rates, but hopefully turning some of maybe the transactional relationship into more of a philanthropic relationship. And increasing the philanthropic support from your highest level members and engaging them more on the leadership, you know, potentially annual giving and feeding into the pipeline for larger donors over time. The biggest thing that we observe with clients that we work with is that oftentimes there is way too much of a uniform set of communication strategies or collateral that's going out to a very diverse set of constituents. So the first thing I'd say is understand that your constituents, your members, are not a monolithic group. Start asking the question of what motivated the visitor to come to your institution, to become a member. Suzanne used the example of the Alexander McQueen exhibition at the Met. For individuals that chose to sign up for a membership at that point in time, it was a very specific reason. They were interested in the exhibition. They wanted to skip the line. The communication with them going forward to try to retain them as members is going to be very different than someone that's living in New York, passionate about the Met, and is more generally interested in the programming and the exhibitions that they have across the encyclopedic museum that the Met is, as opposed to a very specific special exhibition. So even if you don't have a systematic way to capture what the motivations are, start asking yourself those questions as you're thinking about the communication efforts around re-engaging or further engaging your membership base. Also understand that diversity, as you identify differences among your population creates a really nice opportunity for further engagement. You have to trust and have faith in the mission of your organization that once individuals feel engaged, your programs and services are going to sell themselves. We all know that the number of times that an individual visits an institution, or the number of events or performances that an individual has the pleasure of enjoying that your institution puts on, that's a very good indicator that they're going to be further engaged either at a membership or a philanthropic level going forward. So as you understand the diversity, if it's someone that's very interested in a special exhibition, the next time your institution's putting on an exhibition of that genre, you can focus your communication efforts in a tailored manner to engage them in that very specific programmatic line. Also know that, as this has come up already a couple times in the presentation, that some members come once a year, some don't come at all, and some come once a month. Let's understand that the way in which those individuals feel about the institution is going to be very different, and the messages that resonate with them naturally is going to vary. And also the motivations and behaviors. We use the skip the line example as one motivation for a membership. The decision to become a member, maybe it's a family discount, a unique exhibition, a general passion for the institution. Let's have the intersection of understanding what the motivations are, as well as the behavior over the year, to come up with some customized messaging to retain them as members, and then hopefully change their perception and their relationship with the institution to be more philanthropically focused. Also, engaging your constituents on their terms. This ties directly into what data you know about your members and donors and building a profile. I'll give you one very simple example from an institution that we've had the pleasure of working with. They had a special exhibition, and they realized that a lot of the individuals that became members as a result of that exhibition were individuals that fit the profile of their medium to high-level donors. The institution had conducted a robust set of donor profiles in the 6 months prior to have a good understanding of their top-tier and middle-tier membership / donor levels. And then when they looked at the new members that came on board as part of this exhibition, they realized that these were individuals that on average fit exactly the mold of those medium and high-level donors. So rather than just having the conversation, as Suzanne mentioned earlier, be about benefits and the things that come along with being a member of the institution, switching the conversation to really be philanthropic focused, and what the overlay of philanthropic support can really mean to the institution in enhancing the programming. The other thing I'd say on this slide is that, whether it's a visitor, a member, or a donor, individuals want to feel that you understand them. Uniform communication doesn't give the recipient of that material the feeling that they're special. Just to use a couple examples, you don't want to treat a 65-year-old that's an empty nester the same as someone that's 35 and has 3 young children, or someone that lives in a gated community 50 miles outside a dense urban area from someone that chooses to live in maybe an equally as affluent area but in a denser environment. On average, it typically says something about individuals that choose to live in those sorts of areas. So once you know the general profiles or set of profiles of large swaths of your constituency, you're now in a position to develop these customized messages. Page 11 lists just some of the examples of information that we typically encourage clients to look at in the donor management system or your membership database. And if you're using a system that integrates the two pieces of information, that's wonderful. This is not an exhaustive list. Visits aren't on here, but these are the ones that we most commonly find are informative to start building a basic understanding of individuals. Giving history, most institutions have a very good understanding of giving history and membership level history. Also understanding the geographic distribution, particularly if you're in an urban environment, What percentage of your members are in a 5, 10-mile radius of the institution? Pick the appropriate distance in your environment versus individuals that are 15, 20 miles and plus out, and do the profiles and the makeup of individuals in those different geographic areas differ? And if they differ, what does that tell us about potentially their motivations to being a member? Demographic information, some of this you may have, things like age, some of it you may not have. The good news, though, is that demographic info and other externally appended info is relatively inexpensive to acquire. So oftentimes, age, presence of children, estimated household income are very common data elements that clients like to have to help build a profile for their particular subsets of the constituency. Also have listed here, obviously, a very important group, your volunteers, board members, and committee members. I would imagine that most of you have this information pretty well recorded in your database. Moving on to page 12, this talks a little bit about the external information. So I mentioned on the demographic side, if you don't have this info already, relatively inexpensive to acquire, things like income, home market value, age, marital status, presence of children, are they a homeowner or a renter? As you have a collection of data elements like this, and we'll see this in a few slides, it can help you get a greater understanding of the makeup of individuals, and if you're seeing trends and concentrations to start to build profiles. Not necessarily a profile of each individual member, that would be an onerous task, obviously, but trying to bucket into maybe 2, 3, 4 different segments, subsets of your constituency. PRISM segment codes as well. I'll have a couple of examples of these later in the deck, but they're a consumer and lifestyle indicator. I gave you that example of the difference between someone that's 65 and an empty nester that lives in the suburbs versus someone that's 35 and has 3 children and lives in an urban environment. These are codes where you can very easily differentiate between the two. And then for some of you, I'd encourage you to think outside of the box as well of what information may be useful for you to have a sense of whether the member or the donor exhibits that characteristic to then communicate with that larger group in your database, or even for member acquisition as you're trying to communicate with the general population that may not yet be members or even visitors to an extent. I had a client recently, religious affiliation was an important indicator on the higher end of the philanthropic spectrum. Maybe hobbies, is someone particularly interested in reading about international affairs. There's really a myriad of data elements that you can acquire and start to think creatively internally, and then you can engage a variety of firms to help you through that process as well, where you think a data enhancement might inform your strategies. On page 13, I've just shown you an illustrative example of what a profile might look like. This is a top-tier membership level at a leading national museum. You'll notice that the map is of the LA area. It's not a leading national museum in LA. We've combined the map and the profile here to blind this a bit, but it still gives you a flavor of what we mean by a profile. What's the average age? What's the gender mix? Is there a particular ethnic, racial, or religious concentration, affluence, or education degree? You can see this top-tier membership level is pretty stereotypically affluent. And on the older end, and tilts female as well. One thing I would say, though, that this slide doesn't effectively communicate, but we see it a lot with clients that look at the distribution, let's say, for example, of household income across their whole entire membership base. One of the things that they find, which surprises them, is that they're more diverse than perceived in the community. And that can be a great data point, irrefutable distribution of, let's say, middle or upper low income individuals that are actually general members of your institution, and you can use that to inform a case for support to corporations or foundations. So this is not just a way to identify the cream of the crop from an affluent standpoint, I would encourage you to think creatively about what would it mean to have an understanding of the income profile of your entire constituency as you're crafting messages to the community at large, and then potentially, corporate foundation or government grants that may be available to your institution that want to see that you're serving a diverse population and not just the haves of the community.
And conversely, I would add there that with this particular profile, it led us into a discussion of, this is an institution that's done a lot of outreach to other communities. Their upper-level membership looks like this. What does their lower-level membership look like? If they are seeing more diversity at that level, what are they doing to try and engage people more effectively in moving them up in membership? And if that's not true, if their membership really looks the same throughout its levels, why are they not able to turn those visitors into people who feel some sort of ownership stake in the museum? So that leads to a whole other set of questions.
Thank you, Suzanne. Great point. On page 14, this talks a little bit about the different channels of communication. This isn't earth-shattering revelations here, but just thinking about the different ways in which you communicate with your membership base and your donor base. As we're talking about building profiles, understanding that it's a diverse group and that you want to build at least some set of customized messages, even if you're bifurcating your population into 2 or 3 groups. It doesn't necessarily have to be 50 different groups, recognizing that this does take time, energy, and resources to come up with the customized messages. But once you have segments that exhibit certain characteristics, what are your main communication channels with them? Mail, email, telephone. Is there also opportunity for individuals that are prospects, whether they be high-level members or donors, that live in a close geographic footprint for in-person meetings? This could be a great opportunity to train staff members that maybe it wouldn't be appropriate to put them in a major gift officer type role meeting with major gift prospects. But if there's an individual that they seem to be at the data indicates that they should be at the level of, let's say, giving $5,000 annually, an individual that maybe wouldn't warrant a major gift officer meeting with them, but if there's someone else on the team that can deliver the message in person, show that you care, understand the prospect's interests and desires, and then potentially more fully engage them with the institution, while the added benefit of a professional development angle is as well. The other point I want to make on this slide is this last bullet of what is the appropriate mix for a particular group that you're looking at. We recognize that resources, particularly in this continued weak economic environment, are constrained. So you can't do everything for everybody. But I think the most important takeaway with understanding a diversity of channels of communication is that you don't just pick one channel for a certain subset. So as you're creating these profiles for your constituents, if you have 3 different groups, don't pick one group and say we're only going to email to them. Even if their method of becoming a member was via online, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to renew online. Most constituents, members, donors, non-members, they want to be communicated with in a multitude of manners, recognizing the resource constraint. But don't just put all your eggs in one basket for picking a specific channel of communication. Hit them at appropriate points in time, deposits, if you will, with a direct mail piece or an email and the like.
And as much as possible, this really needs to be data-driven. And I will give you an example from a client with whom we're working right now. They have a special event annually, and there was one group that purchased tickets that had a high correlation in their attributes with their higher-level members, and it was the group that bought the family 4-pack. So if you were just going on your sort of preconceived notions of who might look the most like your donors, you might think it's people who bought high-level tickets with special access. In their case, again, it was the family 4-pack. So as much as possible, we encourage you all to really segment this based on data. Really look at who those people are who purchased it so that you are then communicating with them not on your preconceived notions of who buys a family 4-pack, but in their case, you're communicating to those family 4-pack buyers as if they are a similar audience to your highest level donors.
And as we move to the next session of using analytics, this springboards right off of Suzanne's point there, we have some, call them case studies, illustrative examples of the types of ways in which we encourage clients and institutions to use the data that they have on their members to drive decisions. So have everything, to the extent possible, be a data-driven strategy, not just an anecdotal good idea. For this first case study of analyzing a benefit, what I would highlight at the outset is that this organization was looking to increase membership retention as well as gifts from members. The other important thing to know is that their biggest benefit was events. Now, for many of you on the call, the biggest benefit may just be attendance itself to the institution, priority ticketing for special exhibitions, whatever it may be, the principle is the same. If there is a benefit or a collection of benefits that are important to your members and you have a way of tracking to the extent that they're using that benefit, use that to inform a trend analysis to see if you can start to observe behaviors that can then give you a set of calls to action to actually change or improve behaviors for the set of the population that isn't already behaving in the desired manner. So at this Public Policy Institute, they were looking at the number of events attended related to the annual contributions. Page 17 looks at a particular membership level and what the makeup was. So very similar to the way in which we built the profile for the leading national museum. You can see some of the breakouts here for the household income. Average age for this institution was quite a bit younger than that other institution that we looked at. I don't want to belabor too much of the specific data on each of these slides. I want to keep it high level, macroscopic. We're sharing this presentation with all of you on the call, so I'm not going to go line by line, but this should give you a flavor of the ways in which you can build a profile for a particular level. Page 18 shows the PRISM distribution at this particular membership level. So they had a very high concentration at Young Digerati and Bohemian Mix. For those of you on the call that have used PRISM before, you'll know that they have nice 2- and 3-word phrases that nicely characterize individuals that fall into these categories. One thing I would say here as a tangent but related, and it'll get all of your, hopefully your wheels turning of ways in which you can creatively utilize PRISM segments, is that the ways in which organizations outside of the social sector or the nonprofit space use PRISM codes. I'll give you one very basic example. You go to the airport and you're looking to check in at that kiosk, and it prompts you, do you want an upgrade? One of the ways in which they decide what your upgrade dollar amount should be, whether it's $25 or $150, is what PRISM segment you fall into. It's not the sole indicator, but it's one of the bigger indicators. Another quick example is Target. You have a large retail operation, they send you all discounts in the mail. One of the ways they decide which discounts to send you is your PRISM segment code. So hopefully that can get you to start to think creatively about the ways in which you can more actively communicate in a tailored manner to, as we've said, subsets of your constituency. Page 19 shows a particular distribution at this institution. The column that I would call your attention to, without getting too attached to this illustrative data specifically, is here we were looking at the donor penetration relative to these different PRISM segments. If you exhibit very different behaviors from a donor penetration standpoint, so how many members are actually making gifts over and above their dues, with a finite set of resources, let's focus efforts on those that are actually contributing and have a philanthropic engagement with the institution at a higher level. And then page 20 and 21 are examples of two of the most affluent segments. These are segments that we found are pretty strongly correlated to philanthropic behavior. You can get a flavor with the types of information that's provided in these PRISM segment codes. I should say PRISM segment codes in the U.S. are provided by Claritas, which is a subsidiary of Nielsen, the television ratings company. And they're one of the leading firms in this household segmentation data. So 20 has upper crust, which is those suburban communities that I was mentioning, and then young digerati, the wealthy younger families that typically live in more of an urban environment. Page 22 and 23, the next slide, look at the number of events attended at particular membership levels. And page 22 looks at the number of events prior to becoming a member. So we can see a very clear correlation between the number of events and the higher membership level. So the leadership group, on average, it was 8.5 events. They love the events, they love the institution, then they make a decision to become a member. Well, to the extent that you're tracking event participation in this example, have a tipping point trigger in your system. An individual comes to 3 or more events, have them receive some sort of communication at the general membership level. If you have socioeconomic indicators that say that they're on the higher end of the income scale, maybe after they visit their 5th or 6th time, you're communicating with them more at the higher membership level. So this was a very natural set of conclusions, with more visits equaled a greater likelihood that they were going to become a member at a higher level. And then page 23, again, shows a very strong positive correlation between the philanthropic contributions, so this is excluding the membership level, the philanthropic gifts from individuals that attended events. We see the on the x-axis, the bottom row there, the number of event ranges that we chose in this illustration. The one thing I would highlight is that 40 plus, you'll see this precipitous drop-off. Reason there's this drop-off is you have a group that just loves to go to events, is totally thinking about this as a transactional relationship. They're the coupon individuals. They like a discount. They have no interest in having a philanthropic relationship with the institution. They just think they put on great programs and they're getting it for a steal.
So now we're going to look at how you can use segmentation to make decisions about your budget and your planning for your time over the course of the year. This first slide is taken from one of our clients, an urban botanical garden, and this is a really interesting slide because it tells you something very important here. If you look at columns 3 and 4, percentage of garden constituents, and then the GG&A benchmark. So we looked at the percentage of their donors and members who come from each of these income groups compared to a benchmark of institutions that we identified with the organization as being similar to them in terms of the kinds of people who would support them. And you can see there's a high correlation between those percentages in the 3rd and 4th. So basically, they have the same distribution of people across income levels in their membership that we would expect to see looking at their peers. Then, if you look at the last 2 columns, in all but 2 of the income segments, their average largest gift is significantly lower than the GG&A benchmark. So as we look at the average gift from people at these income levels, across the whole spectrum, they're underperforming. So at this point, their story is unrealized potential in their database. They've got a great database. They've got a database that looks a lot like their peers, and yet they're raising a lot less money from that same group. So we work with them in this particular instance to figure out why this was true and how to address this gap through messaging, through customer service, through benefits offered, personal cultivation, and they were then, the development staff was able to make the case for more resources devoted to this because clearly they had a high likelihood of success. If they put time and effort into this group, they were very likely to get a positive yield. The next slide, we like to call this slide pipeline, because if you will look, cultural institutions are often very concerned about the age of their constituents. And in blue, you see this particular garden's constituents. So they had a concern that their members and donors were aging, and that was incredibly true. If you look at that compared to the GG&A benchmark, they were significantly older. Not only are donors to cultural institutions on the older side, but in this case, they were really older. So what this tells them is that they need to invest in growing next generation of leadership. And in fact, in their situation, next generation were really people 60 to 65. You can see the average age in certain levels was well over 80. And they have a number of levels at which actually every level over $2,500, the average age was over 70. Again, this is a really helpful tool to map out something like this, to create a chart like this. It's irrefutable evidence that you need resources in your program to diversify your group. Otherwise, 10 years from now, you're going to have significant problems. This is where people often have the impression that something is going on in their program, but anecdotal evidence can actually hurt you. In this case, if you have a group of very engaged donors who are in their 60s, you may worry that your audience is graying, but if people can point to these, the sort of known universe of people who are in front of them more often, they may not believe it's a concern. This chart shows without a shadow of a doubt that this is a concern for this institution.
And what I would just briefly add to what Suzanne said is, some of these slides, this can be a scary slide. There is going to be a drop-off significantly with the major donors. Unfortunately, these people are not going to live forever, but it can also be an opportunistic call to action for the institution. Let's focus efforts on that medium age population to really ensure that they feel fully engaged and close to the institution, so they're going to be the major donors of 5, 10, 15 years down the road. So don't just throw up your hands and say, oh my gosh, we are really in a bind because all of our major donors are 75 years or older. Having this data can really inform a nice roadmap of focusing efforts on that 50 to 60-year-old population as an example.
The other thing that this really tells you to do is clearly, while you're working on that population, make sure that your planned giving messages are very strong, that you're really communicating that. And this will give you an idea of whether or not you've really talk to enough of your donors about planned giving. Obviously, this institution needs to be doing that in the short term, even as they grow their middle-aged population in the long term.
Absolutely. We're going to close out the presentation with just an example of the ways in which you could build a membership model to compare where your members are currently relative to where they should be based on what the external assessment of data that individual members exhibit indicates that they should be. The one thing that I would say before explaining this model quickly is that this can be done internally as well as externally. We recognize that there's varying levels of sophistication as well as staff bandwidth to perform tasks like this. You all have full-time jobs already, and to think about going on a statistical modeling exercise may seem too daunting. What I would encourage you, though, to take out of this slide, or this presentation, I should say, is that hopefully there are certain aspects that you can immediately implement, low-hanging fruit, things like age and income distribution. That slide that Suzanne walked you through of looking at income distribution relative to the average largest gift. If you have a flat distribution, let's more effectively communicate with the more affluent folks than the middle or lower income individuals. That doesn't require an expert third-party counsel to help you go through that. Some of the more sophisticated stuff you may want to bring in a partner to help you, but I'd encourage you to distill parts of this presentation to aspects that feel manageable, that you could take on piecemeal to start to improve your program tomorrow. In this botanical garden example, we developed a model based on the factors listed at the bottom of the page. All these factors we've already talked about today. A lot of them are intuitive, as you'd imagine that they would be a good indicator of membership level that an individual should be at. This next slide, page 28, is a chart that shows the current level on the left-hand side. So you see that current donor levels reading vertically there on the y-axis, and then on the x-axis on the top of the table, it says GG&A recommendation. This could be data-driven recommendation, whatever you want to call it. What does the data tell us if we didn't know anything about what membership level that individual was in? So if we look at Executive Circle as an example, there's 78 individuals that we've tagged as Executive Circle, and the institution currently has them in Executive Circle. If you move one below, there are 15 individuals that are currently in the Executive Friends membership level. We've tagged them as Executive Circle, or data's indicated that they could be at the Executive Circle level. That's a manageable group. I don't care what size your development or membership operation is. That's a manageable group. Let's meet those individuals and see if we can further engage them and upgrade them. All of the light green numbers, those are all the upgrade potentials. The beige in the upper right-hand corner, these are the individuals that we love. They're giving more than the data indicates. Let's not tell them that. Let's just enjoy the fact that they clearly feel passionate about the institution. So you leave those alone. The upgrades is in the green. And this one slide alone can really be a framework and a call to action for 3 months of implementation. And then closing out the presentation, we have a couple slides that we wanted to leave you with about testing your strategies. Similar to how we started the presentation with the qualitative and quantitative audit, take these questions back to your teams and ask the group to collectively think about the ways in which data has informed past decisions, the ways in which maybe you've tried to use data to drive strategies and it hasn't worked effectively, and then most importantly, how are you capturing information, incorporating it into your program. This last bullet has just a survey. The only thing I want to highlight here is do it with individuals that don't renew as well as those that do. That can be a very interesting comparison. Oftentimes, surveys are just conducted with the members that stay on board around benefits, but definitely take a look at the individuals that didn't renew after that first year. And then 31 has some questions around the renewal rates. Now that you have this set of profiles and segmentation understanding with your constituency, where can you look at returns on investment, changes in conversion rates, ROI for particular direct mail solicitations or whatever it may be. Encourage you to reflect and think about your program in context of improving the efficiency of the operation as you're using data to inform decisions, and then ultimately growing the program. And then the end of the presentation, just some takeaway bullets. If you don't remember much else of what Suzanne and I have said, you'll have the slide deck and you'll have these takeaways. I think the upshot of this whole presentation is you have a lot of data at your fingertips. Think creatively about ways to use it. Test strategies among subsets of your constituency. Don't be afraid to do that. You can always go back to what you were doing before, but really try as much as you can to have data drive your strategies going forward. Thank you all for your participation today, and I'll hand it back to my colleague, Joan.
Great. Thanks, Matthew. And we're a little short on time, but we'd like to address one quick question. For those of you who have to jump off, please submit your questions by chat before you go. We'll address them in our follow-up email. And once we finish up, we'll also leave the session open for a few minutes if you want to type in your questions afterwards and chat to us, and we'll respond to them via email with our follow-up. And you can also expect a recording and a slide deck coming your way by email, too. But if we could just address one quick question. We got a question from someone who's at an institution where the membership and development departments work independently, and this person was wondering how they can increase communication and collaboration between those teams.
That's a great question, and one that we get a lot, since membership and development often are separate groups within the advancement program. I'll give an example of what we're doing with one client. In fact, next week I am going and meeting with them, and we are meeting as a team. Membership, development, and marketing are all meeting together first to talk about what have we learned about each of their constituent groups, people who come to events, the people who become members, and the people who become donors. What do we know about them, and how can we most effectively strategize about communication? So part of it, I think, is really trying, whenever possible, to create a collaborative team effort. So that's the first thing. And we're actually doing a brainstorming session about how do we use that information and talking about each of the areas so people have the opportunity to give ideas to their colleagues in different program areas, and to hear ideas from people who aren't in the thick of it day to day, but probably have some really good thoughts about how the institution can communicate most effectively to each of its constituents. And then from there, it really depends on the institution. It's really understanding your cultural norms. Do people really communicate by email? Is it important to have a regular meeting to talk about how you are addressing these as collaborators? Most importantly, I would pick one or two small projects that you can do where you're going to share and create some sort of win, so that somebody can see through, if you have a colleague who's reluctant maybe to make that time, through collaboration you're actually going to get better results for both of your program areas. And I think identifying that and maybe even brainstorming with a colleague about somebody in your own department about what that could look like is really important. And so that's a tough one, and at some institutions it's easier than others, but again, you know, with our client next week, we're starting out with a shared meeting to discuss this as a whole group, so it really sets the tone for we're one team.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you, Matthew, and thanks to our participants for joining us. And again, submit any questions through chat. We'll leave this open for a few minutes to allow you guys to do that, and thanks so much.